Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar will be on advanced coloring and painting in Clip Studio Paint. It will be hosted and presented by John Rauch. Before we begin the webinar, there are some housekeeping items that we'd like to go through. First of all, the webinar will be approximately 1 hour long. All attendees will be muted. The Q&A session will be during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Attendees can ask questions in the GoToWebinar question box right away. Due to time constraints, not all questions will be answered. The webinar will be recorded. The recording will be shared on social media and will be sent to all registrants and attendees. As well, today's panelists are myself, Fahim Niaz, Joanna Brower from Celsius, and John Rauch, your presenter. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time and have never heard of Clip Studio Paint, Clip Studio Paint is your all-in-one solution for stunning, ready-to-publish illustrations, comics, manga, and animations. To learn more, please visit us at www.clipstudio.net/en or at graphicsly.com. And with that, we'd like to pass the reins of the webinar over to John, who will begin his presentation.
Hey guys, so I'm John. I have been working in comics since 1996 when I was a junior in high school. I started at a place called Heroic Age Studios. Ironically, studios plural, there was only one. I initially worked in Photoshop 3.1, I believe it was, on a Mac Quadra. So I'm a Photoshop kid from way back. Before that, it was a little bit of Prismacolor pencil and MS Paint, that kind of thing. Since then, I think it was around 2000 or 2001, I had my first Wacom, and I used that for several years. I eventually upgraded to a Cintiq. Currently, I typically color on an iPad Pro 12.9 inch, but today I'm on a Wacom Mobile Studio Pro of a friend's, and it's working pretty well. You can see I have my tools set up now. This is not the way it comes out of the box. I basically closed everything I'm not going to use and put just the stuff that I need for coloring out. So if you're looking for a fairly minimalist setup or as close to it as you can get, maybe note some of that stuff. I'm sure you can make improvements that go along with your workflow. Anyway, getting started though, so I thought I'd talk about this worksheet that I've created. Essentially, before I was even contacted about doing this webinar, I had been working on a worksheet that I'm going to be disseminating as instructional material at some point, where I kind of took inspiration from the Marvel universe, especially the most recent movies where they fight Thanos and all that. And I just decided to make some characters that kind of teach the principles I want to teach here. So right off the bat, before we get into that, I'm going to show some basic tools we'll be using. The G pen, the wand, and the bucket specifically. If you've ever done flats in Clip Studio, you may be familiar with these. If not, I'll show you some of the relevant stuff. So right off the bat, P on the keyboard will switch you between the G pen and the pencil. We'll choose the G pen here. Over here on the G pen, I don't know if you can see my cursor, hopefully you can, there's anti-aliasing. I like to choose none, the hardest edge possible. If I switch to the wand, which is W, I can click this little tool guy here, the wrench, and under anti-aliasing, I can make sure that is selected off as well. And the paint bucket, I don't think that has a keyboard command, but you can go to that and also make sure anti-aliasing is off right there. Sometimes it'll come with area scaling or this multiple referring layers thing. Those are really useful. I'm not going to get into them immediately right now, and as much as I can avoid it, I'm not going to make this super technical about how Clip Studio works. It's going to be mostly about coloring. So the three tools here that we have, and I'll switch over to my notes file so I can demonstrate them. The G pen is what I'm going to use to make solid lines. So you can draw anything you want with that. If you zoom in real close, you can see that stair-steppy edge there. That means there's no soft colors, there's no 50%, there's no halfway between what fills and what doesn't get filled. And the benefit of doing that now is we can switch over to the wand tool and we can get that precise selection. And if we decide we don't like it, we can change it after the fact. I can delete it back out. There's no fringe. If I wanted to keep it, I can make some adjustments to it. It's very editable and keeps your file size small and your layers minimal. So I like to use those as much as possible, those three tools: the G pen, the paint bucket, and the magic wand. So now that we have those down, one of the first things you'll need to address if you start coloring is layer setup. And I created these three characters up here. They are Bomb Bunny, Arthur Starr, and Avant-Garde. And basically each of them represents a different layer setup here. Back in the old days, even prior to me in the 90s, they used to cut film and they would layer the film in, I think it was 25% increments of cyan, magenta, and yellow. And then the K plate, which would be the black film, would just be for the line art, preferably. That would be 100% black, and you try not to use black anywhere else. And that was how they printed it. After things went digitally, there was kind of an interpretation of that where we had to do the same thing on screen or something similar to it. Back in the old days, the Photoshop 3 days, what we would do is use an alpha channel to house the line drawing while we color in the CMYK or the RGB layer. And then at the end, you could load that channel, you could fill it into your final, and you just have one single flattened image with lines on it. So this Arthur Starr guy that I've got, he kind of represents that old school style. So let me get down and manipulate his layers here. You can see if I turn off these lines, you can see exactly what's underneath them. There's the color information, and then the line information is stacked right on top of it. So that's one way you have to go. Moving on from that, we have Avant-Garde here. Let me, there they are. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to go to Bomb Bunny first, actually. That's a little more relevant. So Bomb Bunny is kind of an upgrade on that general setup, except in this case, we've used some of the tools that I was just talking about to make these hard edges, and I've included the lines and the color on a single layer now because I don't need an extra one, because I can manipulate each of those colors separately with the hard edges. It's super easy to wand them, to select them, to make changes. If I decide that I want to change his carrot, I can easily make a hue saturation adjustment there. I could fill it with the new paint bucket color. Very easy to do. So then after that, I simply made a layer on top of it that I named render, and I would advise always naming your layers if you can. It's going to save you time later in the image. So I named this layer render, and I put it on hard light. What a hard light layer does is let me paint in highlights and shadows onto the same layer and not affect any of my base flat tones or lines. So you can see, even if I get rid of the flats underneath it, you can see basically what I added to that new layer just with the rendering. And in that case, I'm a little less, if I want to make a change to the rendering, I can go back and wand from my base layer, switch over to the render layer. There's also that multiple referring that I mentioned to earlier. There's a shortcut for that where you can wand from a layer without switching to go to it. But now that I'm there, I can make some changes to that rendering within a masked selection if I want. So that's more of a modern approach to a layer setup for coloring. And then this avant-garde, I had to put this in here just because I think minimalism should be represented, and I think it's a factor. We should always be looking for the simplest setups we can find. This is just a very graphic approach, no rendering, except that there's some hard edge rendering that's given the same amount of priority as the lines. So in this case, let me switch over to the layers on avant-garde. I can manipulate line and color. There's virtually no distinction between the two, just by paint bucket, by wand, any of those tools will make it super easy. Let me see here. And you can see I can just fill in new colors anywhere. And if I turn off this follow adjacent pixel, it will hit all of the instances of a color. So if I don't like that accent color, if I want to change it once and all over the image, I can do that. Actually, while I'm here, I'm going to zoom in also and show the difference between an aliased and anti-aliased edge. So you can see on the edges of this text here, this is anti-aliasing. And it was a feature to make those stair-steppy edges a little less obvious. But if you have a high enough resolution image, I think I'm perfectly content with sharp edge. So over here to the notes that I made in advance. Basically, you have three different approaches you can take to layer setup. The old school mode is just lines on top of color. It's very simple. The modern is as many layers as you need, as many blending modes as you need, but we can get a little more creative. It doesn't have to be limited by the old technology, the old way this stuff was made. And then the minimalist way is just putting everything we can as clean edges on one layer so that we can get back to it later. And you know, it's minimalist is a direction, not an end goal, if you've ever seen that documentary that everybody's seen. So, you know, if you need a couple layers, if you need something, you're still working in that direction. But those are probably the three ways that you should think about setting up layers. And then you can customize per job with what you think would be useful. So moving on from that, the next thing that you're going to want to do if you're on a coloring assignment or if you're coloring your own work is probably going to be the rendering and the lighting. So I created a couple characters here, a male and a female, and I thought I would just point out the different styles of rendering, the things that you would want to point out in them, and how you would achieve that. So on cotton candy here, you can see I've got a bunch of different textures here. When I'm rendering anything feminine, and when I say feminine, it doesn't mean it has to be a female, and when I say masculine, it doesn't have to be a male. I'm talking about the qualities. So if you are rendering a scene that seems to be action-based, you know, I would tend to associate that with masculine. If you are doing something a little more homey and familiar to regular people outside the superhero genre, that kind of thing, you know, sometimes that goes a little more feminine, and there's for sure room for personal interpretation and your own artistic style here. But the way I like to think of it is kind of like a priority list. So if I'm rendering something feminine, I'm thinking about how does it feel? I'm looking at the texture, I'm looking at the atmosphere, I'm looking at the general shape, the figure that I'm emphasizing. You know, am I trying to show off these long curves, or am I trying to show off some super bright explosion in the distance casting a light on them? Or, you know, there's a difference in how you can approach that stuff. So you can see on cotton candy, I have a bunch of different textures here. Her stockings, for example, those were done with the G pen, very simple. I just scribbled it in the same way as if you were drawing. I just drew in some marks and they imply some texture. She's also wearing like a silkish shirt with some fishnetty stuff underneath it. Different techniques. I used the watercolor brush. I complemented it with some hard edges there. You can kind of see it makes a little bit different feel. The scarf, again, that's kind of candy rendered. It's shiny. It looks like it's plasticky. She's got her hair, which is very fuzzy and soft. All of this contrast between materials is what's going to sell that type of rendering. And then moving on here to the masculine side, we got Inconceivable. He's actually kind of a throwback. If you followed my career at all, I colored Invincible for Skybound for several years, and he was kind of my go-to superhero rendering style here. So I thought I should draw something up that nodded to him a little bit. So when I'm rendering masculine type things, the things I'll think about, I can't remember if this is called a mnemonic. You remember in grade school when they were teaching you these little devices to remember a rule set? The one I like for this kind of superhero rendering is divide and conquer. And I like to think if the lines at all support it, if I'm not fighting what's there, I love it when I can divide the main figure into somewhat equal areas of light and shadow. And I think the play creates a really interesting conflict. It creates some drama. It definitely fills out the space, the 3D space in the viewer's head, so they can kind of get an idea as light hits this, light also fills out what kind of shape it takes. So when you're rendering masculine things, you know, you're looking to create that drama and conflict between the light and the shadow. You're definitely looking to make sure all of the important details are popping here. I made a little joke in my notes about make them abs pop. But you get the idea. It's very detail oriented. It's very shape oriented. And the female rendering is a whole lot more about how things feel. It's a whole lot more atmospheric. And you can see even down to the tools I used here. I've got this hard edge rim light on the guy, got this soft edge one on the girl, and you can mix and match that, but it gives you a general idea how you can go in either direction. Moving on from that, I've got a couple characters here, Brick Mason and the Unchewable Hunk. Oh no, I did that thing where I rotated the screen. You guys are going to have to deal with me where I rotate it all the way back around, because I haven't yet learned the other way to do this yet. Okay, so sorry about that. Brick Mason and Unchewable Hunk. So these guys are kind of two sides of the same coin in coloring. On one side, you've got the, you know, sometimes you get an assignment and you'll have an artist that's super structured. They're building their images. It's composition first. They're focusing on overall form and shape and the planes. And then they're dividing that up and adding character and detail and texture. And you can tell that there was a process, there was a structure, that every line on the page is there to indicate a real 3D form that could exist in 3D space and work. Unchewable Hunk, on the other hand, this is, maybe imagine your favorite 90s artist, right? He's got a lot of style. He does some great stuff with inks. It's super clever. But maybe he just drew that right on the page without any structural lines, any support. So we're going to go through how to handle both of those kinds of styles, drawing styles, and the lessons you can bring out of it. So if I was coloring one of those more structured artists, the types of things I'm going to be thinking about, I want to think hierarchically, first of all. I want to follow a similar thought process to the artist that created it. That way I can interpret what they're doing and emphasize it well. So first off, I'm going to be thinking about structural and composition related things. If there's anything I can do with color choice, with general contrast between the flat colors that's going to help sell the planes or the silhouettes of the image. Those are going to be my first choices. Second to that, I'm going to focus on bringing out the dimension to it, and I'm going to add light and shadow and fill it out in a 3D sets. Third step, and you could have a lot more steps than this, that's just the short list, but the third step is the detail. That's where I'm coming in making all those little markings, you know, the little specular reflections, the scratch marks, the texture. That's where all that happens. And once you're on the same page and you can kind of recognize how the artist you're working with, or if it's you, that's even better, is making those decisions, then you can make your colors kind of coincide and you can do similar stuff at similar points in the process, which only helps sell the work. On the unchewable hunk, however, we're going the opposite direction with this guy. This guy, let me switch over because you might want to see the layers on him. There we go. So you can see on him, I've got this base layer, and it's fairly flat. It doesn't have a lot of shape to it. What you want to do in these cases is start with the lines that are there and extrapolate out into the space where there aren't lines. You know, look to trace those lines as much as you can and figure out where they're going, where they end, and fill up the space in the middle. It's not a perfect process. You might have to do some finagling around, some hatching, some fill work. But you can get a feel for how this artist makes lines, how he makes shapes, or she, and you can basically emphasize that working from the outsides in, working from, rather than a mid-tone out, you would start adding shadows, adding highlights, and then filling in that middle ground. One second here. Okay, so moving on from there, the next guys I have on here, got this bottom row. We have Tracer and Ink Thinker. On Tracer here, so I thought I was clever. Sometimes I do that. One of the problems that I've had as a colorist in the comic book industry is sometimes you have to make corrections on the fly. Sometimes something will be drawn incorrectly. Sometimes you will get a patch that somebody else pieced in or you have to piece in and it's not perfect. Sometimes you'll just be expected to make a fix on the fly. In this case, we have, and this will be a little more clear once I open up the layers on it. Lesson 4, Tracer. So in this case, you can see that I have the lines to this guy, and he had an arm drawn in at one point, and it's not there anymore. And what he has now, what was fixed here, looks like it was probably 2 left arms, like it was just pasted back in there, and we recognize that as a problem. So when I'm coloring that, I'm going to be looking for ways to draw attention away from that. So one of the things I do here, and you can kind of see it, is I will use some kinds of contrast to create static and draw attention away from those areas. And here you can tell I used red and I used a little bit of a purple and a little bit of a teal, but they're all similar saturation levels. They're all similar value ranges. So they create some kind of information that draws a little bit of attention, but when you look at it, it tends to just blur together. It's not important information. So I kind of use that to distract from these lines that overlap here. And of course, in a live situation, I'd just clean that up and get rid of those lines. But I wanted to show exactly how much you can do to distract from a mistake like that just because I think it's valuable to be able to direct attention when you want to. So one of the things I did here, after creating that static information, is to go way off, and I went pure white, but you could go either direction on the value or saturation scale to make this pop out and start using it in places, hopefully logically, that will draw attention. So I picked this line over here along his arms and shoulders, and I just added some white sparks. I added some reflections, and you can see at regular size, it's not immediately obvious that we're looking at a guy with two left arms there. It's at least salvageable now. So, you know, that wasn't intended to be a perfect fix, but definitely some principles that are worth considering if you're going to be trying to direct attention around a page for mistake-based reasons or just because it's a smart thing to do. Following that, the last guy I've got here is Ink Thinker. And earlier this year, I actually had a chance to color, what's his name? The Silver Surfer, sorry, several times, and worked with a few artists on it. And it was really fun noticing how, you know, I think there are some expectations when I'm hired to do a job, and I think I was expected to bring something to the table there, or at least I imagine that I'm supposed to fill in some of this space and add something interesting to the image. And when you get into it, when you zoom in and really start doing that, the only way to make it work is to understand the lines that you're getting from the artist who drew it and extrapolate from them. So in this case, going back to that G-Pen tool, one of the things that I found super helpful is I will go to stabilization, and you can use anything up to, I think 50 is the highest I've used. 35 is about as practically high as you probably have reason to go. But let me show you the difference here. We'll go with 0. I'll have to switch it later for this guy. With 0 stabilization, I'm just drawing lines. It's exactly the line that I draw, exactly where I put it. Leave that there actually. And if I crank this up to, let's say 50, I'm going to be dragging this line around behind me, making for some much easier, smoother curves. So that's your, you know, you don't need a French curve. You can make all that stuff up in here. It's super easy. That's how I did the initial drawing and how I brought out all of these little shapes inside here. And you can see they're just lines. You know, the goal of this was to kind of make it unclear where that line is between the actual line drawing and the color. It should just be finished art if you do your job right. At least in this scenario. Nothing wrong with having lines that stand out if that's what you're looking for either. So you can see here on tracer, we're using contrast and static to direct and divert attention. You can kind of see the problem area there I X'd out. You can see the new area I wanted to focus on. On Ink Thinker here, basically the point here is to recognize that it's not lines and color anymore. Another valid approach is just art. You know, you can extrapolate and add to the art yourself as a colorist. You can kind of blur the distinction between the lines and color. And as you're doing this, you know, that you have some more options than a line artist may have. After you draw a line, you can change the color of it. After you pick that color you want, one of the things I like to do is I kind of think about my colors fractally a little bit. So for example, if I'm going to be using a red primarily, I could make my red markings, right? And if I want to accent it, I can make a short right turn and up towards the top here a little bit, and I have an accent color that goes next to it. And if I want to try the other direction, I could have made a left turn and gone a tad darker and less saturated. I've got something on that side. So now I have 3 colors on one side of the spectrum. If I wanted to complement that, I can just as easily switch over to a complementary color. I've got a lighter teal here, and I can make similar moves. I can make a short left turn and move up towards the top a little bit. I can make a short right turn and move down towards the bottom a little bit. And you can keep following that path and come up with a lot of different color variations that work pretty well together. If you just think of those variables as directions, you can go. So that's another thing you can do there. The G pen helps a ton. Then, of course, being clever again, I had to put this guy in here, the vet. He's the Samuel L. Jackson of the group. Basically, he's here to tell you to check your work. After you're done with the piece, even as you go, it's just a good idea. Every once in a while, just do a quick pan around before you leave a character, before you leave a thing. Make sure it's the way you want. Make sure your colors work. One of the things that I associated with that, I made a correction layer over here at that point. And I did, let me see if I can find it real quick. If you want to do this, you can go to Layer, New Correction Layer, Gradient Map, and you can pick any one of these. I'm just going to go something quick right off the bat. Pick this blue, hit OK. And now that it's in a layer mode, I can change the blending mode, and I can put, you know, a little blue cast over my entire image. In this case, the one I picked actually, the one that I did use, I basically used some cool shadows and warm it up towards the highlight end. And it's going to map those colors onto basically your value range. It's going to associate everything on the page with a value, and it's going to map this color onto it. And then you can change how that applies. So I like soft light for that. It depends on the application. I've used other ones before. So now that we've gone through all of these little mini lessons, the fun part of this worksheet, I think, is this chaos guy in the middle. He's our Thanos-like character. And just using all these tools together to come up with something, a style that's yours, that's unique. And that's the point where I'm actually going to switch over and do a little demo here. So bear with me because I don't work on this machine a whole lot. But we'll dig into this and get going. Oh yeah, plenty of time left too. Lesson 5, chaos. Got them grayed out. I've got some effects layers here. You can kind of intuit how they work. It's fairly simple. I use hard light a lot. Sometimes for contrast, I'll just go with a straight normal layer. If you're using hard light or something kind of poppy, saturation heavy on your rendering, it's okay to just use normal for your effects, or vice versa. However you like to do that is just fine. So checking this guy out, I've got a lines layer, I've got a render layer, I've got a flats layer, and I've got his logo. So we're going to go to the render layer, and I'm actually going to make a new one, new layer, and if I right click on it, I can select clip to layer below. That's going to make the layer below this one, which in this case is the flats layer, essentially my mask for this, so I can't paint outside of that now. Another thing I'm going to do real quick is switch to my wand tool, and I'm going to do multiple referring layers, and I'm going to use this lighthouse option, and I'm going to turn that lighthouse on for the layer that I would like it to reference. So now from my blank layer, I can wand, select the flats, and paint directly into that area too, so I can be even more precise than the general mask. So we're going to pick, let's see, I'm going to pick, I don't like this whole area up here, right in here. So we're just going to redo that right on the fly here and see what happens. I will use the eraser tool real quick, and I'm going to go up to the layer where the rendering is. And I'm just going to pull all of that back out. All right, now back on my newly found layer. And if you don't like those little dancing ants indicating the mask there, you can hide those. That's I'll do that real quick. It's under View, Selection Border. So they're still active, you just don't see it right now. So right now I'm going to take a mid to dark shadow color from my image. I'm going to change this layer to Hard Light. Switch to my G pen. And I'm just going to start giving some dimension to this guy, trying to use some of the principles I was talking about already. And you can see there's no fear of going outside of the lines here. It can't happen. I do still have my stabilization on way too high here, so I'll turn that back down. And you can also save those brushes really easily and save a keyboard command if you want, so that if you have a brush with specific settings that you'd like to get back to frequently and not have to change them one setting at a time, that is going to be available there. Okay, just a little more. Now one more cool trick here. This is one of the things I really like about the G Pen, and I think I actually discovered it back in Photoshop with the pencil tool, which is essentially the equivalent over there, the Peter Parker version of this. You can click on this wrench here in your G Pen, go to Ink, and set this to background. And this is really neat because if you are on a transparent layer now, I'll switch my color up a little bit. Back to the G Pen. And now everything I do will only work in the transparent space that hasn't yet been painted into. You can see I'm staying fairly close to what exists in the lines here. You know, there are times you can be a little brave and add a lot more information. He's kind of front and center here with nothing casting big shadows on him or doing anything too crazy. So I'm just going to work with that and emphasize what's there. One of the things I like to tell myself when I'm coloring is that the thing is the thing. You know, that you can have lots of cool ideas. It doesn't mean they're not cool ideas, but if your idea doesn't emphasize the thing, whatever you were there for, it's not an idea worth pursuing. So I got 2 colors in there now. I'm going to go ahead and throw a 3rd swatch in yet. And I'll keep working towards the middle of this guy. Get that swatch just right. And you can see I'm kind of doing the same thing with color choices that I was talking about on Ink Thinker, where I just move in a direction a little bit. And I'm not going to be super specific about this because after I'm done blocking this in, I'm going to switch over to another tool and show you guys something else. So the other tool that I would use in combination here is the watercolor brush, and I like it quite a bit. You can set your brush density to affect basically how much you're going to be doing on the page with each stroke, and it will also put in some of whatever color you have chosen on there, depending on pressure and your settings. But you can go through here now and brush out all these hard edges, make some new fun variations. You know, if you used a lot of color swatches in there, which I didn't use a lot here, you can kind of push and pull those colors to where they interact with other colors that they weren't up against before. Sometimes you find some happy little transitions that are worth keeping or repeating. Basically, we work in a way that's really easy to edit, so don't feel afraid to try something. So I'll soften this out real quick. And of course, I'm still paying attention to general lighting consistency and stuff like that. I'm not trying to contradict anything that's already there too much, but I am going a little bit quick with it. And you can see just by virtue of being on a hard light layer, how easy it is to come up with colors that still complement what I'm doing here. And if I decide that they're not exactly, I have lots of adjustment here. I have the hue saturation. That gets you pretty far. That does most of the stuff you want to do. I also have a pencil here. I can switch over to the pencil tool if I want some added grit. I notice here there's some hatching. I like to complement hatching with more hatching. I think that's kind of the way to go. Oop, switch brushes on me. Drop weight. Watercolor. Oh no. Sorry about that. It's actually under pencil. All right. So sometimes to complement some of this hatching that already exists, throw a new color in there. And just add some accents of my own here and there. And if they're a little too harsh, don't worry about it. You can brush them out. It's all really easy to do. So, you know, I'm using a little bit of impressionism here. I'm kind of directing the eye and building out the shape with the kind of lines I make. You can make them all consistent. You can make them all go one direction. You can make them all wrap around the form three-dimensionally. You can make none of them do that. These are all stylistic choices you get to make if you even like this approach to rendering, but it's a move that I like to use pretty frequently. So switching back to watercolor now, I'm going to turn this brush density way down. soften this up a little bit. See that? It can be as prominent or not as I like. And I could do another layer, either on this layer or literally create another layer, add stuff on top of that. I think what I'm going to do for now is add some highlights. Switch back to the pencil tool. I'm just going to go with straight up white, even though that's not a great way to go usually. Artistically, I've heard that said that you're not supposed to. Sometimes it just has the most punch, and sometimes it works in your scene. And if that is the case, you do you, and you make your art awesome, and don't worry about anybody. So I can do some more of these little squiggles. That's kind of the signature move I decided to go forward with. It's not the only way to go. You could hatch, you could trace contours, you could cross hatch. Lots of things you can do. And then I can go back to the watercolor and I can smooth it out in a positive sense like that. Or I can actually click the transparent swatch and use it like an eraser, but also smudges a little bit. So that's pretty handy. Finish this real quick. What did I just do? All right, well, let me see here. Just add a couple specular highlights here. Give that some excitement. And you kind of get the idea. But that's basically how I color and paint in Clip Studio. Some of the principles I keep in mind, and a quick demo of this worksheet that I'm going to be debuting hopefully in the next month or two. So Fahim, did you want to take it back?
I will take over from here, and we'll go into the questions for you that we got during the stream. Thank you very much so far. We have a lot of questions regarding your personal work too. First of all, do you have any traditional schooling in art, or are you mostly self-taught?
I made it through 2 years of art in high school, and I got my first job opportunity, and it didn't make sense to quit to go get educated in a thing I was already being paid for. And it actually has been kind of a long road since then, trying to acquire the same knowledge. But no, I don't have any education. It's all been just see a problem, fix the problem.
Okay. What inspires you when drawing?
When drawing, I feel very confident when I color. When I draw, I'm still looking for kind of mastery of that process and figuring out what it's supposed to be about. I refer to that saying I used before, the thing is the thing. When I'm drawing something, what is it I'm trying to capture in it? Is it just a human? Am I trying to capture a feeling, emotion? I think it helps to prioritize like that. So that's kind of the way I try to look at it, at least.
Okay. So on the technical side, how do you choose the colors you use for shading?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to do it. The one that resonates the most with me, I like hard light layers, because you can start with the implication in a hard light layer is that if you filled the entire layer with neutral gray, nothing would happen. It would look identical to whatever was underneath it. Then as you move out from gray towards light, dark, or saturated, it moves in that direction. So I think directionally, I think out from gray. And, you know, there are some basic color setups that work. Sometimes I'll think split complementary, where I'll go one warm direction and two cool directions. But I'm doing the same process that I mentioned before, where I follow a path out, and if I'm making left turns, and you know, it's basically just repeating that, memorizing what was there, and you know, getting to the colors that I think work for selling what that image was.
Okay. You talked at the beginning a little bit about the anti-aliasing setting for your pen,
Yes.
and we got the questions. From which resolution onward do you think it's okay to use a pen that does not have anti-aliasing? Because it does look jagged if you
Sure.
zoom
Yeah.
in a lot.
Yes. I think you were viewing it at like 400% there. Typically, if I work on a comic page, that's going to be print size at like 400 pixels per inch. I think that's a good place to start. At least that, if not 600.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll never notice that when it prints. Ink isn't as precise as pixels.
Yeah. Okay. And you also showed the stabilization feature for a part of the introduction. It seems it's very difficult to predict where the lines are going with this, the settings as high as you did them. How do you determine the flow of a pen with that?
Sure. So it depends on the kind of line that I'm going to be drawing. If I need to make a sweeping arc that's going to go across an entire page, you know, that's not a move that I could make with a very fast arm movement and still end exactly where I need to. So that's a case where I may turn the stabilization up really high so that I can slow down my stroke a little bit and be precise with the starting and ending point, but still get some nice smoothing in between. If I'm drawing shorter lines, if I'm zoomed in and drawing detail, I'm going to turn that way down or not use it at all.
Okay. You also showed a lot of the texturing, like in the end with the hatching. How do you usually approach your texturing work?
I like to view it the same way. Like I want to say the book I have is Scott McCloud, but I like to approach it like an inker. There's a book that I read when I was younger that just talks about how to imply these textures rather than create them literally. And I think that's a much stronger effect. I think it's more practical, and it gives you a chance to have your own visual language. So, you know, if in your world, sand is illustrated by, you know, toothbrush flecks with whiteout, you know, then it is. And if you're working digitally, then you're using something like that. And if you want to indicate leather with cross hatching, or, you know, you make those rules. You get to decide which marks indicate which thing, as long as you can pull it off, basically.
Okay. You mentioned in the beginning that your layers are organized and named, which I think a lot of artists struggle with. Do you have any tips for people who struggle with organizing their work?
You know, I wouldn't put too much pressure on it at first, other than to just be looking for ways that you can simplify, but it's going to come down to your workflow. What I try to do here is just expose people to a few ways, because I don't think there is one absolute right way. I think it's just good to understand structurally how to do it. As a base, I would say that my go-to that I use the most often working from the ground up would be a flats layer, which will have like my G pen and bucket, just complete flat colors that I can wand and select from. Above that, I'll have a base layer, which is typically a duplicated version of that layer that I've brushed out. I've added some textures. Occasionally, I'll use filters on that. The layer above that will typically be my rendering layer on hard light, where I can do the light and shadow. Above that will typically be a line art layer, and then one more above that will be where I do any line or similar work in color for special effects or REM lighting or that kind of thing. That's me, though. I think that was 5 layers. Some people get away with 1, some people have 300. You know, it just depends on how complicated you work, what your workflow is like.
Okay. What are your first thoughts when you start coloring a page?
I think I prioritize more just being able to stare at a page and figure out what it's about now. I just like to look at it and, just try to figure out, if I didn't draw it, I want to be inside the head of the person who did. I want to know what was important to them, what was the number one idea they wanted to convey with this, what are the supporting facts, and I want to organize everything I do so that it tells the same story they're trying to tell.
Do you personally have anything that you like to color a lot, or what's your least favorite thing to color?
I think most of the stuff that I went over on the feminine rendering part is probably where I have the most fun. Not just because it's women. I like getting into the textures though. I like that contrast of material against material. I think that's probably the most fun for me, is being able to switch up the tools, switch up the look, and keep it all inside of an image and relating to the other stuff.
Okay. You talked a little bit about the digital courses you were going to create. Can you repeat that and make any predictions on the plans of releasing a course in these types of techniques?
Sure. So it took me a little while to make up this worksheet, and I still have a little bit to go on it, but it's mostly there. I do have probably about 100 hours of, I'm creating a chat bot who basically, if you want to work on this worksheet and learn these things, the chat bot will walk you through it conversationally. So I'm building that now. I hope to be done. 2 months would be the most that I could go without feeling bad about myself as a human for.
Okay, so a bit in the future, where can we find the worksheet when it's done?
So the chatbot will be the primary source, and that'll have a Facebook page and probably an Instagram page. It will just be called Crayon King.
Okay.
Anybody who follows me on any of my existing social media now will be very hard pressed to not see that come up in their timeline, because I've been posting about it plenty. So if you follow me anywhere, you'll see the links when it becomes relevant.
Okay, wonderful. One more question on your professional works. Like, how much input do you usually have when you're hired to color something in terms of what's already there?
It varies wildly. Some artists will be very protective. Some artists if I'm coloring another artist's work, sometimes they want to talk to you beforehand. They want to know what you had in mind so they can tell you that was wrong and then tell you what they had in mind. Other times I don't hear from anybody. Other times I will get a job, maybe not even with the relevant reference. I'll Google it myself, I'll color it, I'll turn it in, and an editor or art director will just say, great, thanks. So it's everywhere between those. And sometimes there's multiple rounds of revisions. It varies.
Mm. What's the easiest and most fun for you, when you have more freedom or when you're more guided in that?
The egomaniac in me wants to believe that everybody who hires me just wants a crack at whatever genius is waiting in my head to pop out, and that I could just go crazy. But sometimes I need to be reined in a little bit.
Okay.
Somewhere towards the end of freedom, but not entirely.
Okay. And then we have like a very broad question to close this off. What do you think makes a good illustrator?
I think priorities make a good illustrator. I think you need to be able to look at the job, decide what it is you're actually being hired to do, not get stuck in the weeds of, making the perfect line or putting down the perfect color, but implying the right emotion, implying the right action, the right feeling. I think the people who focus on that are going to get the other stuff right.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was it in terms of questions. Thank you for your answers and taking the time to do this.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you, John. For all of you who are still with us, if you'd like more information on Clip Studio, please visit us at clipstudio.net/en or graphicsly.com. This webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on YouTube at both the Celsius web channel as well as the Graphicsly channel. So please make sure to subscribe to both of those as well. Once again, thank you so much, John, for your time. I really appreciate it. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure the audience learned a lot as well. For those of you who are interested in keeping in touch and keeping connected to John, please make sure to follow him on social media. You'll see his handles right there. As well, there are a series of surplus questions that were not answered due to time constraints. We'll make sure to pass those over to John, and John will interact with you guys and answer some of those questions on his social media. Once again, thank you, John, for your time.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Take care, everybody.